A working-class white woman boards a plane with her brother to surprise their mom on her second wedding day, but just minutes after takeoff, a first-class couple demands they give up their seats, and when she refuses, things spiral out of control. The plane gets grounded. A retired lawyer steps in, and what happens next exposes a hidden bias nobody wanted to admit. Stay with me. This one will shake you. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you watching from right now? And if you've ever felt invisible in a place where you were supposed to belong, you're not alone. It all started like one of those days that felt almost too good to be real. Claire wiped her hands on her jeans, staring at her reflection in the microwave door. It was still dark outside, but she'd already been up an hour, packing and repacking her single-worn carry-on like she was heading for a once-in-a-lifetime adventure, and in a way, she was. Today, she and her brother Jamie were flying to Atlanta to surprise their mother for her wedding. Not just any wedding, her second wedding. After nearly 15 years of widowhood and holding down the family solo like a weather-worn oak tree. At 64, their mom was finally putting herself first. And Claire couldn't wait to see the look on her face when they showed up at the church. Unannounced but not unwelcome. "You packed that scarf," Jamie called from the hallway, brushing his teeth. Claire rolled her eyes. "Yes, I packed the scarf." "The bluish one?" he asked, mouthful of toothpaste. "No, the other heirloom wedding scarf we have." "Jamie," she shot back with mock annoyance. "It was an old thing." "Really?" "Pale ivory with tiny blue embroidery. The thread pulled loose in places. Their grandmother had worn it under her veil in 1944. When she married their grandfather before he shipped out, their mom wore it tucked in her purse at her wedding to their dad. And again at his funeral, wrapped around her hand like a lifeline. Now, Claire was carrying it to her mother's second shot at happiness. It wasn't fancy, but it mattered. And in the Jackson family, things that mattered were worth crossing states for. Jamie appeared behind her in the kitchen, hair still wet from the shower, eyes bleary but excited. "You nervous?" "Why would I be nervous?" she asked, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "Because we haven't flown in over a decade. Because we bought discount tickets from a website that looked like it was coded in 2003. And because Mom doesn't know we're coming." Claire laughed, the kind of sound that came from deep in the chest, warm and weathered. "Fair, but she's gonna cry." "You know she is." They'd both chipped in for the flight. Claire picked up a few extra shifts at the clinic, and Jamie had sold a signed copy of a first edition Steinbeck he'd been hoarding since college. It was tight, but worth it. They hadn't been on a plane since before their father died. Back then, they flew to visit their aunt in Florida during summers, scraping together points from a credit card that Claire eventually paid off in full 5 years later. Now, just getting to the airport felt like a nostalgic pilgrimage. O'Hare was chaos. Of course, kids screamed, businessmen barked into phones, TSA lines zigzagged into eternity. Claire had never gotten used to the sterile hum of airports, that strange blend of rushing and waiting. Like everyone was late for something they didn't want to go to. But they made it through. At the gate, Jamie grabbed 2 gas station bagels and a bottled orange juice that somehow cost $6. Claire was watching the board for gate changes when a voice chimed next to her. "Traveling for business or pleasure?" an older man asked, his face framed by a halo of white hair and a pair of sharp blue eyes that twinkled with mischief. Claire turned, a bit startled, but instantly charmed. "Pleasure? Our mom's getting married." Again, the man grinned. "Good for her. Life's too short not to take a second shot." He introduced himself as Harold, retired, visiting his granddaughter and her newborn baby, his first great-grandchild. Claire nodded with genuine warmth. He had that old-school Southern courtesy about him, not syrupy, but sure-footed, like he meant what he said, and he said it because it mattered. As Jamie joined them, Claire did the polite thing and looped him into the conversation. Jamie, to no one's surprise, started asking Harold about literature because of course he did. By the time boarding started, it felt like they'd known the man for years. They were seated in row 16, middle of the plane. Claire took the aisle, Jamie the window. The middle seat was empty, at least for now. Claire always preferred the aisle, more legroom, easier access to the restroom, and a better escape route if things got weird. She wasn't exactly paranoid, just efficient. As the last few passengers trickled in, Claire noticed a woman near the front having what could only be described as a full-body disagreement with a flight attendant. The woman, late 50s, perfectly curled blonde hair, oversized sunglasses perched atop her head, was gesturing wildly. Claire couldn't hear what was being said, but she'd worked in ERs long enough to recognize the look, entitled, irritated, and used to getting her way. "Here comes the storm," Jamie muttered under his breath, following her gaze. "Not our problem," Claire replied, "except it became their problem." The same flight attendant, tight blonde bun, tight mouth, now appeared beside their row, dragging along the agitated woman. "Excuse me," she said, her smile thin as plastic wrap. "We're having a bit of a seating issue. Mrs. Peterson here was supposed to be seated next to her husband, but due to a mix-up with the upgrade system, she's been separated. Would one of you mind switching to 28B so they can sit together?" Claire blinked. 28B is near the back, middle seat. "I'm sorry," Claire said slowly, "but we specifically booked these seats together. We're running to a family event and need to coordinate some last-minute details." The attendant nodded politely, but her tone cooled. "Of course, it's just that 28B is an aisle seat as well." "And no," Jamie said softly, "it's not." The woman, Mrs. Peterson, finally spoke up, sharp and loud. "I paid for first class, and it's not my fault the airline overbooked. Why should we be inconvenienced because they won't move?" Claire's jaw tightened. "Move who exactly, you?" "Mrs. Peterson said, eyes flicking over her like she was inventory. "You look like you'd be more comfortable in the back anyway." Claire's breath caught, not because of what was said, but how it was said. There was a tone, a lilt, that dismissive drawl of someone used to being served, not sharing space. "Excuse me." Claire's voice was low but steady. "Look," the attendant cut in, "we're just trying to resolve this quickly. If one of you could kindly—" "No," Claire interrupted. "We paid for these seats. We're staying in these seats. And that should have been the end of it." But Mrs. Peterson's face darkened. "I don't understand why you're being so difficult. You don't look like frequent flyers." That was it. Claire wasn't proud of what happened next. Her hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a fury so old it felt ancestral. She reached for her phone, tapped the airline's customer service line, put it on speaker. "Yes. Hi. We're on flight 21872 to Atlanta. We're still on the tarmac. I'd like to report an incident." She looked directly at the attendant, at Mrs. Peterson, at every passenger now staring in silence. "Yes," she said, "I believe we're being targeted for removal from our seats because we don't look like we belong here." The entire cabin went still, and that's when everything changed. Jamie shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting the crumpled magazine on his lap as if it were a shield. The tension in the air was so thick that even the toddlers 2 rows back had fallen silent. Claire's heart hammered against her ribs, her free hand clenching and unclenching over the soft fabric of her jeans. She could still feel the weight of Mrs. Peterson's gaze, a mix of outrage and confusion, as if Claire's refusal had upended the natural order of the universe. Somewhere deep in Claire's chest, an ancient stubbornness stiffened her spine. She wasn't moving, not this time. The customer service agent on the other end of the line had picked up quickly. Her voice professional, if a little mechanical, Claire carefully and methodically explained the situation, keeping her voice even despite the heat she felt rising to her cheeks. She repeated the key points for clarity. She and her brother had booked these seats weeks ago. They had made specific arrangements for accessibility and convenience, and now they were being pressured to relinquish them, apparently because another passenger deserved them more. She didn't need to embellish. The truth was enough. Meanwhile, Sandra, the flight attendant, hovered awkwardly in the aisle and occasionally glancing down the plane like she was looking for backup. Miss Peterson huffed and crossed her arms dramatically, her pearls catching the harsh cabin light with every movement. A few rows back, Harold leaned slightly into the aisle, watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression. Claire caught his eye for the briefest moment, and something passed between them. Not pity, not shock, but a steady, unspoken agreement. Stand your ground. The conversation with customer service ended with a promise a formal report would be logged immediately, and the captain would be informed that a passenger had requested to speak with him regarding a possible discrimination incident. Claire hung up the call, her hands trembling slightly with the release of adrenaline. She tucked her phone into the seat pocket, then folded her hands in her lap and stared straight ahead. Jamie said nothing, but she could feel the heat radiating off him. Her brother was many things quiet, tender, slow to anger, but nothing got under his skin faster than unfairness. A few uncomfortable minutes passed. Boarding had all but stopped. The final handful of stragglers trickled onto the plane, giving Claire and Jamie wide-eyed glances as they passed. No one spoke directly to them. No one intervened. But the entire cabin was vibrating with that strange, metallic hum of human discomfort. Sandra retreated toward the front, conferring in low, urgent tones with another crew member. Mrs. Peterson stood planted in the aisle, refusing to return to her assigned seat. Jamie leaned over, his voice low and bitter. They think we're trash because we don't have monogrammed luggage and gold cards. Claire snorted humorlessly. Joke's on them. We don't even have credit cards. It was then that Harold made his move. Quietly, without any fanfare, he stood up from his seat in the economy section and walked a few steps up to their row. His movements were slow but deliberate, as if giving everyone ample time to notice without causing panic. He stopped next to Claire's seat and addressed Sandra in a voice that carried enough authority to slice through the mounting anxiety. "Excuse me," he said calmly. I couldn't help overhearing. "I'm sitting in 28B, and if it helps, I'd be more than willing to switch seats with Mrs. Peterson." Sandra blinked, thrown off balance by the sudden offer. Mrs. Peterson, meanwhile, recoiled slightly, her mouth opening and closing as if about to object. "That way," Harold continued, "these young people can remain seated together, as they clearly intended when they booked their tickets, and Mrs. Peterson can still be accommodated closer to her husband." Claire turned slightly in her seat, looking up at Harold. There was nothing performative in his manner, nothing self-congratulatory. He was simply offering a solution, one that preserved both dignity and practicality. Sandra hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Peterson as if awaiting her permission. Mrs. Peterson gave a tight, brittle smile. "Well, I was hoping for an aisle seat. I have a condition that requires easy access to the restroom." Harold smiled back, the edges of his eyes crinkling. "Luckily for you, my original seat was a window seat, and this middle seat here," he gestured between Claire and Jamie, "would leave you with the aisle. Seems like the universe has sorted it out nicely." Claire almost laughed at the masterful politeness of the man. Mrs. Peterson, clearly outmaneuvered, muttered something about making the best of it and finally slid into the seat next to Claire with a sour expression. Harold, for his part, stooped to retrieve his small leather satchel and made his way toward the back of the plane. As he passed, he offered Claire a small, almost imperceptible wink. Claire felt a weight lift from her chest, just slightly. Sandra murmured something about preparing for takeoff and hastily moved away. Other passengers, who had been watching with thinly veiled interest, gradually turned their attention back to their phones, their books, their conversations. The world around Claire and Jamie snapped back into its muted, indifferent hum, except it didn't. Not really. The atmosphere around row 16 remained strangely brittle, like glass stretched too thin. Mrs. Peterson stared rigidly ahead, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. Claire leaned toward Jamie and whispered, "We're going to need to watch our backs for the rest of this flight." Jamie smirked. "Good thing you were a shot put champion in high school." Claire smiled, but it didn't quite reach on her eyes. The adrenaline hadn't worn off. Beneath her steady breathing, a current of rage and sorrow still pulsed not just for herself, but for the small indignities people like her and Jamie carried every day. The assumptions, the glances, the doors that closed without a sound. It wasn't always overt. Sometimes it was just this, the casual expectation that they would step aside, make room, be flexible, disappear. The engines rumbled to life beneath them. Over the intercom, a cheerful male voice welcomed everyone aboard Flight 2187 to Atlanta and announced a slight delay due to last-minute seating adjustments. Claire almost laughed out loud. She could imagine the sanitized version of events that would be filed later minor disruption. No fault assigned. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. For a moment, she let herself drift not into sleep, but into memory. She saw her mother, younger and vibrant, pushing a second-hand stroller up a gravel driveway. She saw their dad at the kitchen table late at night, scratching numbers on a notepad, trying to make the math work. She saw herself, 13 and furious, in hand-me-down jeans while other girls paraded around in designer brands. And she saw Jamie, always a little shy, always a little out of place, quietly carrying their family's history like a secret badge of honor. The fastened seatbelt sign dinged. Claire opened her eyes just in time to catch Sandra walking briskly back down the aisle, this time with another flight attendant in tow. The second woman was younger, black, her name tag reading Jasmine. She looked uncomfortable. Sandra stopped next to their row and addressed Claire and Jamie with a saccharine smile that immediately put Claire on edge. Mr. and Miss Jackson. Sandra began, and Claire had to fight the urge to correct the assumption that she and Jamie were married. Because of course, unfortunately, we've encountered another issue. It seems Mrs. Peterson's husband has requested to be reseated next to her for medical reasons. We're going to need one of you to move after all. Claire stared at her, disbelief rooting her to the seat. You can't be serious. Sandra's smile tightened. It's airline policy to accommodate medical necessities whenever possible. Jamie sat up straighter. Then why didn't he care about sitting with her before? Why only now? Jasmine shifted uncomfortably beside Sandra but said nothing. Claire glanced around. Passengers were watching again. She could feel it. The curious weight of their eyes. Some looked sympathetic. Some just looked annoyed at the delay. Claire felt a wave of exhaustion crash over her. Harold had stopped halfway down the aisle, watching. He said nothing. He didn't have to. His presence was a silent reminder that they weren't imagining it. They weren't crazy. Claire inhaled deeply. She knew what came next. She could see it play out, the escalation, the threats, the possibility of being escorted off the plane, humiliated in front of dozens of strangers. She could already hear the whispers. It wasn't worth the trouble. They should have just moved. But something in her, maybe stubbornness, maybe pride, maybe something older than both, refused to yield. No, Claire said quietly but firmly, we're not moving. And that simple word, spoken in a steady voice, was the crack that would split the entire flight wide open. Would you have moved? Tell me in the comments, because the next part will change everything. For a few long seconds after Claire's refusal, it felt like time stopped. The hum of the plane's engines, the quiet shuffle of boarding passengers, even the scratchy overhead announcements faded into a heavy silence, like the whole cabin had drawn a collective breath and was waiting to see what would happen next. Sandra's smile faltered, slipping from her face like a mask too heavy to hold. Jasmine looked down at her clipboard, pretending to read something. Though the paper trembled slightly in her hand, Claire sat motionless, shoulders squared, every muscle in her body tight with the knowledge of what she had just done. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't cursed, but in refusing to move, she had committed the unforgivable sin of making herself inconvenient. And in places like this, in airports, in waiting rooms, in board meetings, that was sometimes the only crime that mattered. Sandra cleared her throat delicately. Miss, if you're unwilling to accommodate the Petersons' medical needs, we may have to escalate this to the flight crew. It could result in a delay for all passengers. The threat was laid bare now, no longer disguised with corporate politeness. Claire was the problem. Claire was the reason the plane might not leave on time. Claire was the disruption. Jamie bristled beside her, his jaw clenching so tight Claire thought she heard his teeth grind. Before he could speak, and Claire knew whatever he was about to say would probably get them both kicked off the plane, Harold stepped forward. "If I may," Harold said, his voice cutting through the tension like a hot knife through butter. "It seems to me that the seating arrangements were already settled without incident. The only disruption now is the continued insistence that these passengers, who booked and paid for their seats like everyone else, be displaced." Sandra turned to face him, her professional facade slipping further. "Sir, this is none of your concern." Harold's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Is that right? Well, I beg to differ. I'm a passenger, too. And when I see an injustice happening in plain view, it becomes everyone's concern." The murmurs from nearby rows grew louder, spreading like ripples across a pond. Passengers were leaning into the aisle now, craning their necks to watch. Some were whispering. A man 2 rows ahead pulled out his phone and began recording. The faint red blink of the recording light, a silent witness to the unfolding drama. Claire could feel herself shaking not from fear, but from the sheer absurdity of it all. All they wanted to do was fly home, to surprise their mother, to be part of something joyful for once. Instead of fighting tooth and nail for the most basic respect, Sandra took a step back, composing herself, and spoke into her walkie-talkie. "Requesting presence of captain at row 16. Possible seating dispute escalation." It took less than a minute for Captain Reynolds to appear, tall, with broad shoulders and steel gray hair. He carried himself with the heavy authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. His uniform was crisp, his expression neutral but alert as he approached. "What's the situation here?" he asked, his voice low but commanding. Sandra immediately launched into her version of events, framing Claire and Jamie's refusal as an obstacle to accommodating a medical necessity. She mentioned their reluctance to cooperate, the potential delay to other passengers, and sprinkled in just enough vague language to make it sound like Claire and Jamie were the unreasonable ones. Captain Reynolds listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. When Sandra finished, he turned his gaze onto Claire. "And your side?" Ma'am. Claire took a breath, willing herself to stay calm. "We booked these seats together weeks ago. We were pressured, really, to move to accommodate a passenger who was late boarding and didn't like her seat assignment. We refused. Another passenger offered to move instead, and the issue seemed resolved. Now, after being seated, we're being told once again to move, citing a medical necessity that was never mentioned until just now." Captain Reynolds shifted his weight slightly, processing her words. "And you feel you're being unfairly targeted?" Claire met his eyes. "I don't feel it. I know it." There was no anger in her voice now, just exhaustion. Exhaustion from years of being asked to make room, to be flexible, to understand. Exhaustion from knowing that if she pushed back too hard, she would be labeled difficult. If she didn't push back at all, she would disappear. Jamie, to her surprise, spoke up next. His voice wasn't angry either. It was sad. "It's not just about this flight, Captain. It's about the assumption that people like us working-class people are easier to move, that our time, our comfort, matters less for the first time." Captain Reynolds' expression cracked. A flicker of something regret, perhaps, or recognition passed across his face. He turned to Harold. "And you, sir, you witnessed the interactions?" Harold nodded once. "I did. And if you'll pardon my saying so, Captain, I've seen this kind of thing before, many times. It may not look like much, but it's the small injustices that rot the foundation from underneath." Captain Reynolds was silent for a long moment, the hum of the engines filling the space between them. Then he straightened, speaking in a tone that brooked no argument. "Everyone stay seated. I'll be right back." He strode back up the aisle toward the cockpit. Sandra stood rigid, her mouth a thin line. Jasmine looked almost apologetic, as if she wished she could disappear into the floor. Minutes ticked by. Claire stared at the emergency card in the seat pocket in front of her without really seeing it. Jamie bounced his leg up and down nervously. Across the aisle, Mrs. Peterson fidgeted with her handbag, casting occasional dirty looks their way. Finally, Captain Reynolds returned, his face unreadable. He addressed Claire and Jamie directly. "You will remain in your assigned seats," he said. "No further action will be taken." Claire exhaled slowly, not realizing until that moment that she had been holding her breath. Captain Reynolds wasn't finished. He turned to Sandra and Jasmine. "And I want both of you to meet me in the galley once we're airborne. We'll have a conversation about handling customer concerns." Sandra's face paled slightly. Jasmine nodded, her relief visible. Without another word, Captain Reynolds turned and headed back to the front. The plane finally pushed back from the gate. Claire leaned her head against the window, feeling a bone-deep weariness settle over her. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel triumphant. She just felt tired. But as the plane taxied down the runway, gaining speed, lifting into the early evening sky, a small voice in her whispered, "You didn't move. You stayed. And sometimes that was enough." Do you think standing your ground matters in a world that keeps trying to push you aside? Stick around because the real surprise on this flight hasn't even happened yet. The plane had finally leveled off, the seatbelt sign chiming off with a muted ding. But the tension lingering around row 16 hadn't gone anywhere. It settled into the narrow space like a dense fog, clinging to the backs of their necks. A constant reminder that even though the official confrontation had ended, the unspoken undercurrents still roiled just beneath the surface. Claire shifted in her seat, flexing her fingers where they had gone stiff from clutching the armrest so tightly. Across the aisle, Mrs. Peterson sat rigid and silent, the polished shell of her composure barely hiding the way her jaw clenched and unclenched. Jamie fiddled with the in-flight magazine, pretending to read an article about luxury watches. But Claire could tell he wasn't absorbing a word. His foot tapped rapidly against the floor, an old habit he hadn't outgrown since childhood. Whenever he was trying to bottle up his emotions, Claire wanted to reach over, to say something light and diffusing. But the exhaustion sitting on her chest made it hard to even summon a smile. A soft voice interrupted the brittle quiet. "Can I get you something to drink?" It was Jasmine, the younger flight attendant, standing beside them with a service cart. She was careful, Claire noticed, to keep her voice gentle and her body language open, a deliberate contrast to the rigid, performative professionalism Sandra had worn like armor. "Water would be great," Claire said, her voice hoarse. Jamie echoed the request. Jasmine handed them their cups and lingered for a beat longer than necessary. Her gaze flickered toward Claire's, and for a second, something raw and human passed between them, an apology without words, a confession of complicity mixed with regret. Claire nodded slightly, accepting it without bitterness. Not every battle had to end with a victor and a vanquished. Sometimes it was enough just to recognize the struggle. As Jasmine moved down the aisle, Harold appeared again, making his way up from the back with careful, deliberate steps. He leaned lightly on the aisle seats for balance, the plane's subtle turbulence nudging him side to side. When he reached their row, he smiled warmly. "Mind if I visit for a spell?" he asked. Jamie immediately shifted his legs to make room, and Harold perched carefully on the edge of the empty middle seat between them. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," Harold began, "but I'm proud of the stand you took. It's not always easy to resist when the system's stacked against you." Claire gave a small, tired laugh. "Doesn't feel like much of a stand, just feels exhausting." Harold nodded knowingly. "That's the trick they don't tell you about, isn't it? They make resistance so tiring you start thinking compliance is easier. But every time someone refuses to budge, even over something as small as a seat, it chips away at the rot." He leaned back slightly, studying them both with a shrewd, assessing look. "I've been around a long time," Harold said. "I've seen a lot of fights. Some were in courtrooms, some were in the streets, and some, believe it or not, were right here in places like this. Planes, buses, waiting rooms, places where power pretends to be invisible but weighs on you all the same." Claire sipped her water, letting his words settle over her like a blanket. "You know," Harold continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "I marched with Dr. King." Jamie's eyes widened. Claire sat up straighter, almost spilling her cup. "You You marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., she repeated. Stunned, Harold smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. Sure did. Selma to Montgomery, 1965. Bloody Sunday. I was fresh out of law school. Thought I knew everything. Turned out, I didn't know a damn thing about courage until I saw those folks crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Claire felt a strange rush of emotion, awe, grief, gratitude all tangled up in her chest. I got my head cracked open by a state trooper's baton, Harold said almost casually, tapping his temple. Left a scar you can still feel if you know where to look. But it wasn't about the bruises. It was about the witness, being there, refusing to back down even when it would have been easier, smarter to run. He looked at Claire pointedly. Sound familiar? She swallowed hard, blinking rapidly to keep her emotions in check. Before she could reply, Harold continued. I spent the next 40 years practicing civil rights law, housing discrimination cases, voting rights violations, workplace harassment, you name it. Most of the time, we didn't get a big headline, no parades, no statues, just small victories, one stubborn inch at a time. Jamie exhaled slowly. That's incredible. Harold waved a hand dismissively. It was necessary. That's all. He leaned in a little closer, dropping his voice to a near whisper. And what you did today, standing up for yourselves, refusing to be shamed into moving. Even when they tried to dress it up in bureaucracy and politeness, that's part of the same fight. Don't ever think it's not. Claire sat very still, the plastic cup sweating in her hand, her whole life. She had thought about activism as something big rallies, protests, fiery speeches from podiums. She had never thought about it happening here, on a cramped commercial airplane, in the simple, stubborn act of staying seated. Harold stood slowly, pressing a hand to his lower back with a grimace. Well, he said, smiling, I'll leave you two to your water, but don't let anybody tell you today didn't matter. It did. He shuffled back down the aisle, pausing to chat briefly with a young mother struggling to calm her toddler, offering a joke that made the child giggle and the mother's shoulders visibly relax, watching him. Claire felt something loosen inside her, something that had been wound tight for far too long. She turned to Jamie. You hear that? She said quietly. Jamie smiled. The first real smile she'd seen from him in hours. I hear it. They sat in silence for a while after that, sipping their water, the drone of the engines wrapping around them like a lullaby. Outside the small oval window, the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of gold and crimson. As the flight attendants prepared for beverage service, Claire found herself thinking not just about their mother and the surprise that awaited her, but about all the unseen battles people fought every day. Battles over respect, over dignity, over the simple right to exist in spaces where others thought they didn't belong. She thought about Harold, young and scared, but marching anyway. Crossing a bridge under a sky full of tear gas, she thought about her father, taking double shifts at the mill so she could have new sneakers for gym class. She thought about herself, sitting here now, tired but unbowed. The world didn't change all at once. It never had. It changed like this, one seat at a time. One refusal at a time, one small, stubborn act of courage at a time, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Have you ever realized that the smallest stand you took mattered more than you thought? Stay with me because the real twist on this flight is still coming. And it's something none of them could have seen coming. Claire thought that after the tension of takeoff, after standing her ground, after Harold's quiet blessing, the worst of the journey was over. She allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope, settling deeper into her seat, even daring to smile when Jamie cracked a joke about the absurd price of in-flight Wi-Fi. They both knew they wouldn't pay for it. Some luxuries just weren't worth surrendering your pride for. Outside the window, the world stretched endlessly, cotton clouds swirling like lazy dancers across a soft blue floor. But peace on airplanes, much like in life, was a fragile thing. It never lasted long. Less than 30 minutes after Harold's visit, As Claire was flipping absent-mindedly through the safety instructions card she'd already memorized twice over, Sandra returned in surprise. Her footsteps clipped sharply down the aisle. A plastic smile stretched so tight across her face that it looked painful, trailing a few steps behind her. With less certainty, was Jasmine, the younger attendant. Her expression unreadable. Claire felt her stomach clench even before Sandra stopped at their row. Ms. and Mr. Jackson, Sandra said, using that same falsely sweet tone that Claire now associated with imminent trouble. I'm afraid there's been a further complication. Claire slowly set down the card, her heart rate picking up again. She exchanged a glance with Jamie, who muttered under his breath. Here we go. Sandra continued. Her hands folded neatly in front of her like she was reciting from a script. The captain has been informed of an additional issue regarding Mrs. Peterson's travel companion's seating. There's been a medical disclosure regarding Mr. Peterson that requires the couple to be seated together for the remainder of the flight. Claire blinked, trying to absorb the audacity of what she was hearing. She had been around bureaucracy long enough to recognize manufactured language when she heard it. And let me guess, Claire said, keeping her voice level. You want one of us to move again? Sandra's smile didn't flicker. For the comfort and safety of all passengers, we're asking for your cooperation. Around them, the cabin's atmosphere shifted palpably. People were watching now, openly. Some sympathetic, some annoyed, some simply hungry for spectacle. As travelers so often were when trapped in confined spaces, Claire leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped tightly together. You already accommodated them by moving Mr. Peterson into the same cabin. Harold Jensen gave up his seat so that could happen. Now you're telling me that's still not good enough. Sandra stiffened. Jasmine, standing slightly behind her, visibly winced. Jamie spoke up, his voice sharp with disbelief. Is Mr. Peterson's medical emergency so urgent that it only occurred after we took off? Funny how that works. Sandra's jaw tightened. But before she could respond, Harold appeared again, walking carefully but quickly up the aisle. Passengers shifted to make room, and there was an energy gathering around the scene now, a crackling tension in the recycled air. I'd like to speak with the captain, Harold said firmly, addressing Sandra without raising his voice, but somehow commanding absolute authority. Sandra's plastic smile cracked. Sir, the captain is currently engaged. Then disengage him, Harold said calmly. Because if you continue down this path, you'll find yourself dealing with a formal discrimination claim on behalf of these two passengers and, if necessary, with federal aviation authorities. You could have heard a pin drop. Sandra hesitated, flicking her gaze from Harold to Claire to the growing audience of passengers. Claire caught sight of several phones being held discreetly but unmistakably, recording everything. She could almost hear the headlines forming: passenger dispute, allegations of bias, airline under scrutiny. I will inform the captain, Sandra said finally. Her voice clipped. She turned and retreated, Jasmine following but glancing back with an apologetic look that Claire almost pitied. When Sandra was out of earshot, Harold leaned down slightly to Claire and Jamie. She's in a corner now, he said quietly. Keep your heads. You've already won more than you know. Claire nodded, feeling a strange mixture of anger, fear, and grim satisfaction. This wasn't over, but it was changing. 10 minutes later, an eternity in airplane time, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Reynolds. We apologize for the delay and any discomfort. We are committed to ensuring that every passenger's safety and dignity is respected. I have asked the crew to refrain from making any further seating changes during the remainder of the flight. Thank you for your cooperation. There was a scattering of polite applause, tentative at first, but growing louder as more passengers joined in. Claire sat frozen for a moment, absorbing the weight of it. The simple acknowledgement felt like a victory, a hard-won, exhausting, necessary victory. When Sandra passed through the cabin again a few minutes later, handing out water and coffee, she barely glanced at Claire or Jamie. There was no more fake sweetness, no condescending smiles, just a hurried, professional efficiency a woman doing her job because now she knew someone was watching. As Claire accepted her cup of water, she noticed Mrs. Peterson sitting stiffly beside her, her lips pressed into a tight, furious line. She hadn't said another word since the captain's announcement, but her silence spoke volumes. Claire turned toward the window, letting the low hum of the engines and the rhythmic clink of the service cart soothe her nerves. She stared out at the vast sky, the endless horizon, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself a full breath, filling her lungs until it almost hurt. It wasn't just about the seat. It was never just about the seat. It was about refusing to be invisible, about insisting on being seen, about the quiet, stubborn dignity of staying exactly where you had the right to be. Jamie leaned over, bumping her shoulder lightly. "You good?" Claire smiled faintly. "Getting there. Mom's gonna flip when she sees us." Claire laughed, the sound surprising even herself. "Yeah, she's gonna cry all over her dress." They sat in companionable silence for a while. The worst of the storm seemingly passed. Claire closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engines lull her. She thought about their mother, about the wedding, about second chances. She didn't see Harold approach again until he was standing beside their row, holding something in his hand. It was a napkin, folded neatly, with a handwritten note in blue ink. He offered it to Claire without a word. Curious, she unfolded it and read, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Margaret Mead. Claire felt her throat tighten. She looked up, blinking fast. But Harold had already turned away, making his slow, steady way back to his seat. Jamie leaned over to read the quote, then grinned. "You have got a fan club now." Claire tucked the napkin carefully into her bag, between the folds of the old family scarf. Some things, she knew. You kept close. The plane bumped slightly, catching a rough current of air. Claire barely noticed. She was grounded now in a way that had nothing to do with the flight. Sometimes the world didn't change with protests or proclamations. Sometimes it changed with a simple, stubborn refusal to move. Stay with me because the final moments of this flight hold a revelation even Claire couldn't have predicted. And trust me, it's a story you'll want to carry with you long after the plane lands. The plane hummed steadily as it sliced through the evening sky, but Claire barely noticed the muted roar of the engines anymore. Something inside her had shifted, an invisible, tectonic movement she couldn't quite put into words yet. It wasn't triumph. Exactly. It wasn't even relief. It was something heavier and quieter, a seed of understanding planted deep in her chest. The battles people fought weren't always for show, and they didn't always end with applause. Sometimes they ended with silence. Sometimes they ended with a worn napkin tucked into a carry-on bag, words written in shaky handwriting, reminding you that change was a slow, stubborn thing across the aisle. Mrs. Peterson still sat rigidly, staring straight ahead. Claire could feel her presence like a cold draft sneaking under a closed door. But she didn't look over. She wasn't interested in another confrontation. Some people learn through dialogue. Others needed time, years, even decades to see past their own entitlement. Claire had fought her battle already. She had no need to keep swinging. Jamie had fallen asleep in the window seat, his head tilted awkwardly against the pane, mouth slightly open. Claire smiled at the sight of him. He looked younger somehow, like the kid who used to fall asleep in the back of their dad's old pickup after long days at the county fair. Despite everything, Jamie had always carried his hope lightly, like it wasn't a burden but a feather. Claire envied him that. The sky outside shifted from gold to bruised purple, dusk falling in layers. As Claire reached down to retrieve her book, one she had optimistically packed, but never expected to actually read, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned, startled, to find Harold standing there once more, steadying himself with one hand on the seat back. His face was calm, but there was a certain urgency in his posture. "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the empty middle seat. "Of course," Claire said immediately. Sliding over to make space, Harold sat down carefully, tucking his cane between his knees. He exhaled, a sound that carried the weight of many years, then turned to face her more fully. I wanted to say something before we land. He began, voice low enough that only Claire could hear. Claire nodded, setting her book aside. Harold hesitated, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood their weight. Earlier, I told you about Selma, about fighting the fights that matter. Claire nodded again, not sure where this was leading, but willing to follow. What I didn't tell you, Harold continued, was that for every bridge we crossed, there were 10 we never even got near. For every law we changed, there were 100 biases we couldn't touch. He leaned in slightly, his voice almost conspiratorial. But the real fight, the real invisible one, isn't in the courts or in the streets. It's here. He tapped his chest gently. It's whether we let the world harden us, whether we let it convince us that dignity isn't worth the exhaustion. Claire swallowed, feeling something thick and hot rise in her throat. Today, you didn't just stand up for yourself, Harold said. You stood up for every tired soul who's ever been told they didn't belong, and you did it without shouting, without violence, just by refusing to move. Claire blinked rapidly, willing the sting in her eyes to subside. You remind me, Harold added with a small, wistful smile, of my wife. Claire tilted her head, surprised. Your wife, he nodded, his gaze distant now, lost somewhere in memory. Annie, she was a nurse, short, tough as nails, kind to a fault. She once got herself arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a city bus in 1962, months before anyone outside our town had ever heard of Rosa Parks. She didn't do it for headlines. She didn't even tell anyone until years later. She just couldn't move. It was against her soul. Claire felt the napkin in her bag, heavy with new meaning. I lost her 5 years ago. Harold said quietly, cancer. I'm so sorry, Claire said, meaning it more deeply than she could express. Harold smiled again, a tired but genuine smile. Don't be. She lived the kind of life most people only dream about, one where she stayed true to herself. Even when no one was watching, they sat in silence for a while. Two strangers bound by invisible threads, grief, resilience, stubborn hope. Finally, Harold reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out something small, a photograph, worn soft at the edges. He handed it to Claire without ceremony. It showed a young woman, smiling shyly at the camera. Her nurse's cap tilted slightly askew. Her eyes were bright, her stance defiant despite the modesty of her uniform. Claire traced the outline of her with her thumb, feeling an almost unbearable tenderness rise up inside her. She would have liked you, Harold said simply. Claire handed the photo back carefully, like it was something sacred. Thank you for sharing her with me. Harold tucked the photo away and stood slowly, wincing slightly as he straightened up. Claire moved to help, but he waved her off gently. I'll manage. Always have. He gave her a parting nod, then made his slow journey back to his seat, disappearing into the river of passengers and overhead bins and whispered conversations. Claire sat frozen for a long moment, processing everything. It was easy to believe sometimes that you were alone, that your struggles were isolated, invisible, meaningless. But the truth was, and Harold had shown her this, every refusal to yield, every choice to stay when it would be easier to surrender, echoed beyond the moment. Somewhere, someone you'd never meet might be standing taller because you did. The seatbelt sign dinged again, signaling their final descent into Atlanta. Jamie stirred beside her, groggy but smiling. We there yet? He asked, stretching like a cat. Almost, Claire said, fastening her belt. She stared out the window as the city lights of Atlanta came into view, a sprawling constellation against the dark earth. Somewhere down there, her mother was waiting. Somewhere down there, a new chapter was about to begin, not just for her family, but maybe, in some small way, for herself too. Claire tightened her grip on the scarf tucked inside her bag, a reminder of resilience, of second chances, of all the people who had come before her and refused to move. The plane shuddered slightly as it touched down, wheels screeching against the tarmac. But Claire barely noticed. She was grounded now in more ways than one. Sometimes the most revolutionary act wasn't crossing a bridge. It wasn't shouting in a courtroom or rallying a crowd. Sometimes it was just keeping your seat. Are you ready to see how a simple arrival turns into an unforgettable moment? Stay with me because the homecoming is just around the corner, and it's more powerful than you can imagine. The plane taxied slowly toward the terminal, the city lights of Atlanta gleaming beyond the small oval windows like a million tiny promises. Claire tapped her fingers lightly against the armrest, her nerves buzzing again, but for an entirely different reason now. The confrontation was behind her. Ahead was something she hadn't allowed herself to think about too much during the chaos of the flight, the moment they would surprise their mother. Jamie yawned loudly beside her, stretching his arms above his head, nearly smacking the overhead compartment. Claire smiled and swatted at him half-heartedly. "Easy," she muttered. "Don't get us kicked off after we fought so hard to stay on." Jamie chuckled sleepily. Wouldn't that just be perfect? The cabin filled with the usual flurry of activity that came with landing seatbelts clicking open, bags rustling, impatient passengers crowding the aisles before the plane had even reached the gate. Claire stayed seated for a moment, letting the others jostle and hurry around her. She wasn't in a rush, not anymore. As the line of passengers inched forward, Claire grabbed her bag from under the seat. Feeling the comforting weight of the scarf tucked safely inside, she patted it once, a silent promise to herself to carry its spirit into whatever came next. When they finally stepped off the plane into the jet bridge, the heavy, humid Atlanta air rushed to meet them, thick with the scent of asphalt and possibility. Claire breathed it in deeply. It smelled like home, or at least something close enough to it. They moved together through the bustling terminal, dodging travelers and luggage carts, their steps picking up speed with every sign that pointed toward baggage claim. Jamie bounced on the balls of his feet like a little kid, barely restraining himself from breaking into a full sprint. "You think she's gonna cry?" he asked, adjusting the strap of his worn backpack. "Absolutely," Claire said with certainty. "And you better believe she's going to make a whole scene in front of everyone." Jamie laughed, a pure sound that cut through the airport din like a bell. Claire tucked that sound away in her memory, knowing she would need it later, on harder days. They rounded the final corner toward arrivals, scanning the crowd for the familiar figure they hadn't seen in almost a year. And there she was. Their mother stood near the railing, holding a handmade sign that said, "Welcome home." "My heart beats" in bold, slightly shaky handwriting. She wore a dress Claire recognized, sky blue, printed with tiny white flowers, and her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a loose bun. She looked smaller than Claire remembered, somehow more delicate, but her smile was as fierce and blinding as ever. Claire felt something catch in her throat. Before she could move, Jamie broke into a run, weaving through the crowd with a clumsy grace that made several people jump aside. Claire laughed and followed at a slower pace, her heart pounding in a rhythm she hadn't felt since she was a little girl racing home after school. Their mother dropped the sign with a gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. Tears sprang instantly to her eyes as Jamie caught her in a bear hug, lifting her slightly off the ground in his excitement. Claire reached them just as their mother swatted playfully at Jamie's arm, laughing and crying all at once. "My babies," she cried, pulling Claire into the embrace, squeezing them both so tightly it hurt. "You're really here, oh my Lord. You're really here." Claire buried her face in her mother's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and old books and something else, something purely maternal that no bottle could ever recreate. She felt herself shaking slightly, overwhelmed by the sheer rightness of being held like this. They stood there for a long time, blocking the flow of foot traffic. Not that any of them cared. Finally, their mother pulled back just enough to look at them properly, her hands cradling their faces as if to make sure they were real. But how she demanded, laughing through her tears, "You said you couldn't come, that you had work, and money was tight." And Claire shrugged, her voice rough with emotion. "We lied." Jamie grinned, best lie we ever told. Their mother laughed again, full and rich, before pulling them both in for another hug. A throat cleared politely nearby, And Claire turned to see Harold standing a respectful distance away, his small leather satchel slung over one shoulder. He offered a gentle smile, tipping an imaginary hat in greeting. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said warmly. Their mother wiped her eyes quickly, straightening with practiced grace. "Of course not. Honey, any friend of my kids is a friend of mine." Claire stepped back, realizing suddenly that she had never told her mother about Harold, about the role he had played, about how he had helped hold her steady when the ground beneath her had threatened to crumble. "Mom," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to swamp her again. "This is Harold Jensen. We met on the flight. And he's kind of the reason we're here in one piece." Her mother's eyes widened slightly, then softened with gratitude. She extended her hand, but Harold ignored it and pulled her into a gentle hug instead, the kind that spoke of long battles fought in a deep, instinctive respect. "It's a pleasure," Harold said sincerely. "You raised some mighty fine fighters." Her mother chuckled, a watery sound. "Did my best. Their daddy would have been proud." Claire felt the weight of those words settle over her like a blessing. She blinked hard against the sting behind her eyes, focusing instead on the small, vibrant cluster they had formed here in the middle of the airport chaos. A tiny, stubborn nucleus of connection and history and love. They made their way toward the baggage claim together, Harold insisting on carrying Jamie's battered duffel despite his age and cane. Claire and her mother walked arm in arm, the slow, ambling pace allowing space for the hundreds of questions that tumbled out. How was the flight? What had happened? Why did Claire look like she had fought a dragon and won? Claire hesitated for a moment, glancing at Jamie, who gave her a slight nod. So she told the story. Not all of it, not every small indignity, not every sharp word, but the bones of it, about the request to move, about the refusal, about the way Harold had stepped in without hesitation. Her mother listened in silence, her grip tightening slightly on Claire's arm as the details unfolded. When Claire finished, there was a long pause. "Sometimes," her mother said finally, her voice low but fierce, "the world will ask you to move, to step aside, to shrink yourself down to nothing so that others can stretch out their comfort. And every time you say no, every time you refuse, you teach them something they didn't know they needed to learn." Claire swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "You taught them today," her mother said, squeezing her arm gently. "You taught them who you are." Jamie bumped her shoulder with his own, grinning. "And you didn't even have to punch anyone. Proud of you, sis." Claire laughed, feeling something inside her finally unclench. Their bags came trundling along the carousel, battered and dusty but intact. Harold helped Jamie lift them onto a cart, and together they made their way toward the parking garage, the humid Georgia air wrapping around them like a heavy, living thing. As they crossed the threshold from the sterile airport into the open night, Claire glanced up at the dark sky, dotted with a few stubborn stars barely visible through the city haze. She thought about all the people who had come before her, who had refused to move. She thought about Harold's Annie, about Harold himself, about her father, about her mother, who had raised them to believe that dignity wasn't something you earned, it was something you were born with and fought to protect. And as she stepped into the waiting car, Jamie climbing in beside her, their mother fussing over the seatbelts, Harold settling into the passenger seat like he belonged there, Claire felt it deep in her bones. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready for the road ahead. Are you ready to see how even a simple family celebration can become a moment that echoes far beyond the walls that hold it? Stay with me, because the final chapter is about to unfold. And trust me, it's the kind of ending that stays with you long after the last word. The drive to the West Side Cultural Center was short but heavy, with a kind of quiet excitement that buzzed between Claire, Jamie, their mother, and Harold. The city lights blurred past the windows, a river of gold and white, as if Atlanta itself was pulling them towards something inevitable. Claire sat in the back seat, fingers absently playing with the hem of the old scarf tucked inside her bag, the worn fabric soft and familiar against her skin. Every so often, she would glance at her mother's reflection in the rearview mirror, catching the way her eyes shone, not just with tears, but with something fiercer pride. They pulled into the parking lot under a canopy of string lights that twinkled like grounded stars. The West Side Cultural Center wasn't grand by any means, a converted old brick library. Squat and sturdy, but it pulsed with life. Through the glass doors, Claire could already see family members and friends milling about, balancing plates of food, laughing, hugging, dancing awkwardly to the faint strains of Motown pouring from an unseen speaker. Jamie jumped out first, practically bouncing on his heels as he retrieved their bags. Claire followed more slowly, her legs stiff from the flight and the weight of everything that had happened. Harold emerged from the front passenger seat with surprising grace, tucking his cane under one arm and surveying the building like he was committing it to memory. "You sure you don't mind coming in?" Claire asked him quietly. Harold gave her a sideways look, equal parts amused and fond. "After what we've been through together, I think I've earned at least one plate of whatever that delicious smell is." Claire laughed, the sound feeling lighter and freer than it had in months. Inside, the center was decorated simply but lovingly. Photos lined the walls, pictures of their mother from her high school graduation, her wedding to their father, family Christmases, faded birthday parties where Jamie's crooked grin dominated every frame. A makeshift dance floor had been cleared in the center of the room, and a DJ in a silver sequin jacket was spinning classic tracks that made everyone, young and old, tap their feet instinctively. As they entered, a cheer went up. Claire was momentarily blinded by the camera flashes, by the crush of familiar faces rushing to greet them. Aunts, cousins, old neighbors who remembered when Claire and Jamie were just skinny kids tearing through the streets on battered bikes. Their mother beamed. Holding court like a queen surrounded by her court of loyal subjects, she introduced Harold as an honorary Jackson without missing a beat, and he was immediately swept into a circle of older gentlemen arguing good-naturedly about baseball and barbecue. Claire barely had time to catch her breath before she was pulled into hugs, handed a glass of sweet tea, and dragged toward the buffet tables. Plates groaned under the weight of fried chicken, collard greens, macaroni and cheese, cornbread, peach cobbler. The smells alone nearly brought Claire to tears. "You think they saved us a plate?" Jamie asked, wide-eyed. "I think they saved us for you," Claire said, grabbing two plates and shoving one into his hands. They loaded up, finding a corner to sit in just as the DJ shifted the music to a slower, softer track. Claire watched her mother move through the crowd, laughing, dancing a little, her face lit from within by a joy that made her seem almost young again. It was the kind of happiness that couldn't be faked, the kind that came from surviving hard seasons and still finding it in yourself to bloom. Jamie nudged her, his mouth full of cornbread. "You did good, sis." Claire shook her head, smiling. "We did good." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, interrupted only by cousins coming over to tease them, to hug them, to demand embarrassing childhood stories. Every so often, Claire would catch Harold's eye across the room, where he sat contentedly sipping punch and holding court like the honorary elder he was quickly becoming. Eventually, the DJ lowered the volume, tapping the microphone to get everyone's attention. All right, he said, grinning. "We're about to have a few words from some very special people tonight. First up," he paused dramatically, "someone who made a long trip to be here. Someone who has a few things to say about love, about second chances, and about the strength it takes to keep believing." He motioned toward Harold. The room erupted in surprised applause as Harold, looking equal parts embarrassed and honored, rose carefully to his feet and made his way to the microphone. Claire felt her chest tighten again, but this time with something sweeter than fear. Harold adjusted the mic, clearing his throat. "I didn't plan to speak tonight," he began, voice steady but soft. "But sometimes life throws you into the middle of a story you didn't know you needed to be part of." A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the crowd. Claire's mother watched him with open curiosity, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. "I met Claire and Jamie today," Harold continued. "Strangers. At first, Just two kids trying to get home for something important. He paused, scanning the room, letting his words settle. But what I saw on that plane, the way they stood their ground, the way they held onto their dignity when it would have been easier to let it go, that's something rare, something precious. Claire felt her cheeks flush, but she didn't look away. In my lifetime, I've learned that change doesn't happen because of grand speeches or big parades. It happens because ordinary people make small, stubborn choices. Choices like refusing to give up a seat they paid for. Choices like standing up, even when they're scared. Choices like showing up for each other, over and over again. Harold's voice grew rough with emotion. You don't need a headline to change the world. You just need a moment, and the courage not to move when it matters most. The room was silent. Every face turned toward him, every heart beating in unison with the truth he spoke. Harold smiled then, a slow, proud smile that made Claire's throat ache. So here's to Claire and Jamie, he said, lifting an imaginary glass. And to all of us who keep showing up, who keep standing firm, who keep believing, you are the revolution. The applause that followed wasn't polite or forced. It was thunderous, heartfelt, filling the room with a warmth that Claire felt seep deep into her bones. She caught her mother's eye across the room, and the look they exchanged said everything. Gratitude, love, and something even deeper, the unspoken acknowledgement that their family's legacy, messy and imperfect as it was alive and well. As Harold made his way back to their table, Claire rose without thinking. Meeting him halfway, she hugged him tightly, feeling the strength of his arms around her, the steadiness that had anchored her through one of the hardest days she could remember. Thank you, she whispered. Harold just patted her back once and said, no thanks necessary. Kid, just promise me you'll keep your seat when it counts. Claire laughed through the tears threatening to spill over. I will. Later, after the music resumed and the food dwindled and the little kids spun themselves silly on the dance floor, Claire stood outside under the string lights. The humid night pressing gently against her skin, Jamie joined her, handing her a bottle of water. You thinking what I'm thinking, he asked, bumping her shoulder. That we're incredibly lucky, she replied. He grinned. Exactly. They stood there for a while, watching their mother dance with an old family friend, her laughter floating up into the night like a firefly, watching Harold chuckle with a circle of elders who had taken him in without question, watching the celebration of a life that had been hard-won, that had refused to be diminished by loss or hardship. Claire knew the world outside this small bubble hadn't changed. It would still be hard. It would still demand more from her than it ever asked from others. But inside, something had shifted permanently. She wasn't alone. She wasn't powerless. And next time life asked her to shrink, to move aside, to be silent, she knew exactly what she would do. She would stay seated, and she would stay proud. Because sometimes, the most powerful revolutions started in the quietest place imaginable, your own unshaken heart. Where would you draw the line you refuse to cross? Think about it, because someday, maybe sooner than you think, you'll be asked. And when that day comes, I hope you remember this. You are allowed to stay right where you are, and you are enough.